While working at General Electric on October 9, 1962, Oleniak demonstrated the first visible light-emitting diode. It was faint red light LED. Following this, in 1968, Monsanto engineers made the first green LED, which increased the access to the visible spectrum. For decades, only these two could be manufactured, and the debate remains that who would perform the almost impossible task of creating a blue LED. Acquiring the blue LED would have been a revolutionary invention, as we would have all the colors of the visible spectrum. During these 3 decades, all the big electronic tech companies like Toshiba, Panasonic, IBM, General Electric tried their best to make blue LED, but they all failed. The question still remained why it took almost 3 decades to break through this invention. After 30 years or so comes an engineer named Shuji Nakamura, who was a researcher at a small semiconductor manufacturing company named Nishia. The company had to compete against big tech giant in the market, and unfortunately, it was losing this game. By the 1988, due to some reasons, the company told Nakamura to quit. So, to fight against all this commotion and to save his job, he came up with this idea of engineering the blue LED. Fortunately, the president took the gamble and heavily invested on the blue LED project. Now the journey of the Nakamura begins. Before jumping on to the story, first let's have a look at how an LED works so that we can understand why it took almost 30 years or so to achieve the impossible task. So generally speaking, we have 3 kinds of materials when we talk about current conduction: metals, insulators, and semiconductors. Now if we zoom in on atomic level, we have valence band and conduction band. Metals have a lot of free electrons that can cross the band gap and jump on the conduction band. And if we apply electrical field across the metal, the current will flow easily. Look at the insulators. The band gap between valence and conduction is so high that no matter how much electric field we apply, there would be no current. Semiconductors, on the other hand, have very small gap, so even on the room temperature, the electron will go back and forth between these two levels. Semiconductors kind of conduct current, but they are not so useful in their pure form. So how to make them useful? Let's take a silicon and look at its structure. It has 4 valence electrons which go back and forth between conduction band and valence band. If we add an impurity of another atom which has, let's say, 3 valence electrons, an interesting thing would happen. We will get a vacant position which we can call a hole or a positive charge. And now if we apply field across it, the current would flow, and we would say that the holes are moving. We would call it a p-type material, and this process of adding impurity is called doping. Now if we add a material which has, let's say, 5 valence electrons, then we would get an extra electron which would cause the flow of current, and we call it n-type material. Now if we combine these two materials, even if we don't apply any potential or electric field across these two terminals, the current would still flow initially. Because initially the p-type prior to this junction was mildly positively charged due to holes, and the n-type was negatively charged due to extra electrons. And when we combined them, then instantly there would be flow of these charges, and this process would eventually cease when there are enough recombination of charges that creates this extra region, which is called depletion region. Now up to this point we have engineered a diode, but how the light is emitted? Let's zoom in further. When we combine the N and P type, the depletion region is formed, which prevents further recombination. But if we apply an external field, this would push the electrons from valence to conduction band, and they would start crossing the junction and will fall into the valence band. In other words, electrons jumps from higher energy level to lower energy level, and the rest of the energy is emitted as the photon, which has the same energy between these two band gap. Bigger the gap, higher the energy of the photon emitted. Now we know how the LED works. It's when the electrons jumps from higher to lower energy level, then the photon of that specific energy level is emitted. We were successful at making such materials which would give us the red and green photon energy levels. And looking at the spectrum, it was way difficult to engineer a material which would give us blue photon energy gap. So it was almost impossible to manufacture such a pure crystal structure through which these excited electrons could pass without any collision, because then their energy would be converted to heat, which we obviously don't want. At that time, there were only two such materials which could theoretically give energy gap for blue photons: zinc selenide and gallium nitride. Zinc selenide was relatively easy to manufacture, and in terms of mismatch in its crystal lattice, there was around 3% mismatch, and scientists could only manufacture N-type material. On the other hand, making gallium nitride was way harder, and the crystal formed had 16% lattice mismatch. So Nakamura had to not only succeed in making pure crystals of one of these, but also had to make a P-type material. Nakamura embarked on his journey and moved to Florida, where he learned about the famous machine called metal organic chemical vapor deposition, in short MOCVD. This machine is like cooking machine for pure crystals. In Florida, there was a lab where he worked on how to build an MOCVD almost from scratch. And almost after a year, he returned to Japan and proposed to have a new MOCVD. A thing that is very admirable about Nakamura was that he had the skill to customize an MOCVD, which at that time no other scientist would have thought. But Nakamura knew how to customize his MOCVD. So for almost a year and a half, by doing hit and trial and customizing the MOCVD to get different results on making the pure crystals, he eventually succeeded in making a pure crystal structure of gallium nitride. After that, the next problem was to make a P-type gallium nitride. Nakamura again surprised the world and made the P-type gallium nitride. By the 1992, he had all the necessary components to make blue LED. The blue LED was worth inventing. So guys, if you liked the video, please like, share and subscribe.